Well, we are joined now by Australia's 29th Prime Minister, who's also the author of the absolutely compelling memoir, A Bigger Picture, which, as someone who cares a lot about the climate crisis and clean energy policy, I got a lot out of. Malcolm Turnbull, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great to be with you.
Well, it's so great to have you on. I want to start I was so compelled by the conclusion of your book, because the bigger picture goes into, expands your entire life, goes over your career to date. And here you are writing the conclusion in January 2020 during the bushfire crisis. And you're reflecting on that moment as you're reflecting on your entire life and career. We've been talking a lot about this on the podcast. At the end of 2019, it seemed like there was so much momentum for climate action. You started to see kind of rhetoric ramping up from global leaders and activists alike. And then 2020, the bushfire crisis really kind of focused global attention on climate action because of the tragedy. And then, of course, COVID hit. So we kind of stopped and shifted our attention, which, we've kind of thought, well, that's really puts a lot of focus on climate in 2021 as we recover from the COVID-19 crisis as well. When you look at this year, how important do you think it will be in shaping the arc of climate action?
Well, I think you've got a couple of things going on here. I mean, most notably, the change of administration in the United States. Joe Biden is making climate his number one international priority, and he's appointed John Kerry as his special presidential envoy. You've seen the resolution from the G7, to reach net zero emissions by 2050 and halve emissions by 2030. I mean, these are very big steps. So having America away from the table, which is essentially what you had with Trump, was hugely damaging to the whole, agenda for tackling global warming. So that's very good news. There remains in your country, in the United States, and indeed in mine, Australia, the fundamental problem that I wrote about in my book at some length, where you've had global warming turned into an issue of values or identity or belief. I mean, saying you believe or disbelieve in global warming is about as sensible as saying you believe or disbelieve in gravity. It actually doesn't matter what you think about gravity. You step out of the first floor window and, you're going to get a shock when you hit the pavement. Here it's this combination. I think it's very similar in America, frankly. Vested interests in the fossil fuel lobby, right-wing populist politics, and the right-wing populist media. The overwhelmingly biggest single part of that of which is Rupert Murdoch. And they, you've got Fox News in the US is the biggest manifestation of that. And this has been they've driven an anti-science, anti-climate action agenda. And I mean, as I think that right-wing media ecosystem continues further and further down into this market for crazy, you've now got the ludicrous situation in America where they're not only denying physics of global warming, but they're actually claiming that Donald Trump won the election. So, we are now genuinely facing a big challenge to liberal democracies where lunacy and lies have been normalized.
Another huge challenge that countries, across the world are going to hopefully come together and hopefully work on something, work on some sort of solution. As obviously the climate crisis, and that coming together will be COP26. That's going to happen later in November. So what do you think must be accomplished at this year's COP26 event?
Well, we just need to get a stronger resolution, stronger commitment to action. The critical thing is to rapidly phase out the burning of coal and gas. I mean, coal first, gas will be next, because obviously gas is a more flexible fuel. So, that it has its attraction as a peaking fuel. But, it's still the reality is we cannot we cannot arrest global warming if we keep burning fossil fuels, full stop, of any kind. But coal is the first target. We are happily now in the situation where the cost of the cheapest new generation is renewables plus storage. So that's, principally solar, PV and wind on the generation side. There is one thing that I'm trying to, get further up the agenda at the COP, and I've spoken to John Kerry and Alok Sharma, and been in touch with a lot of other governments about this, and that is the need for long duration storage. Mm-hmm. Now, there's actually a commission going on, which I co-chair with the Assistant Secretary of Energy in your government, on long duration storage, between the International Hydropower Association, which I'm a director, and your Department of Energy. And really the key to this, I think, in large part is pumped storage, pumped hydro. As you know, if you've read my book, I mean, one of the big energy, initiatives I got underway in Australia was the construction of the largest pumped storage scheme in the Southern Hemisphere, Snowy Hydro 2.0. But we need a lot more of these. I'm not talking down batteries or discounting other tech, and I'll come to green hydrogen in a second, but right now, if you want to get long duration storage, pumped storage is the key, and about 95% of the energy that is stored in the world, notwithstanding all of the batteries, is in pumped hydro. So, but it takes time. Right. If the three of us got a permit to build a solar farm in a big field somewhere, we could knock it up in 6 months. You could build a wind farm probably in under 12 months. A pumped hydro scheme, because it invariably involves a lot of permitting and civil works and, steel and concrete and planning. Every site is a little bit different one from the other, takes years. And so hence the need to get on with it.
Yeah, and we also need, buy-in from, all the major countries in the world. And, Australia was criticized for playing a major role in some of the failures of COP25 in Madrid in 2019. Yeah. So what did you make of Australia's role in COP25?
Well, I was very disappointed. Since I left the Prime Minister's office, my party, the Liberal Party, which is the dominant party in the government coalition, has swung further away from climate action. It's the politics of it. I mean, it's politicians have to manage politics, and that's people and a whole range of different sources of power and pressure. And regrettably, just as the environmental imperative has become more compelling, and you talked about, Brock, the bushfires is a good example of that, and as the economics of the transition have become more attractive because of lower costs of renewables, so too in Australia, the opposition to taking, at a political level, certainly at the federal level, the opposition to effective action to reduce emissions has become stronger. Where, just today in the press, the National Party, which is the junior member of the governing coalition, mostly representing regional electorates, has been making it clear that they will not support a net zero emission target for 2050. Well, that is honestly the least of what we should be doing. So right. It is a problem. And I think ultimately it will be international pressure that will make Australia's government move, and that may well be in the form of carbon tariffs.
And we know some of that international pressure from the right has been, as you mentioned, the influence of Murdoch media in Australia, in the United States, and the UK. And why do you think, because certainly, I mean, if you look at Murdoch media personalities on Fox News in primetime, they're further to the right of most fossil fuel company statements. Why do you think Murdoch media companies have been so influential in the United States, Australia, and the UK.
Yeah, well, the way Murdoch operates in the UK is a little bit different, but we can perhaps come back to that. Look, I think genuinely there is Murdoch identified a market for crazy, and he's then sought to monetize it. He's done so in a manner utterly reckless as to the consequences. I think Rupert Murdoch has done more damage to American democracy in our lifetimes, anyway, than any other individual you can name. You know, if you look at how fractured the American democracy is today, the idea, that thousands of people could storm the Capitol seeking to hang the vice president, another Hoosie from Indiana, one of your fellow countrymen, wanting to hang him and hang Nancy Pelosi, and over literally a coup. I mean, what fueled that? It was fueled by the lies in the right-wing media, dominated by Fox, to the effect that Donald Trump had really won the election and Joe Biden had stolen it, in denial of all of the facts, right? So, I mean, Biden's victory was a convincing one. So I'm not telling you, you guys live there, so you understand it better than me. But from my perspective, America is more divided, bitterly divided, than it has ever been, perhaps since the Civil War. It's a shocking state of affairs, and I think there is an attempt on the right, on the Republican Party in particular, to try to unremember, or sort of in an almost Stalinist way, erase from history the January the 6th attack on the Capitol. I mean, that must never be forgotten. That is an extraordinary event, but the people responsible for it are not being held responsible, other than the bozos that actually turned up there, and the guy with the buffalo horned helmet and all of those QAnon wackos. But the media outlets, the politicians that really fired it up, they're not being held responsible, and they'll probably won't be, because of the fact that the Republican Party has signed up to this lunacy. I mean, it's terrible. If I could just say this to you, people might say, oh, well, Malcolm, you're an Australian. What are you doing talking about American politics? In a global world, we all have a vested interest in the stability of each other's democracies. But the United States is such a central part of the liberal democratic world. I mean, it really is the foundation of it, in the sense that the foundation stone, it's the bedrock. And when America's democracy is shaken, when America is divided and unable to act, it imperils all of us. So, it's we very often, events in American politics are more consequential than events in our own political affairs.
But if you look at the divisiveness, especially if we focus in on climate, it actually was, like, in some ways less divisive in the late 2000s when President Obama was running for president than it is now. And if in fact, we've had in the United States environmental catastrophes, and if you look at the politicization of those events actually increases. The polarization of those events actually increases after these environmental catastrophes. And I know even Rupert Murdoch used to at least pay lip service more to the science of climate change years ago. And I know you've known Rupert Murdoch for years. Lachlan Murdoch. What do you think is driving this change and the climate denial? Is it just the market for crazies?
Well, there's got to be a political agenda there as well. I mean, Lachlan is much more right-wing than his father. He's not nearly as talented as his father, to say the least. Mind you, being compared to Rupert is always a tall order because he is, one of the most successful media entrepreneurs, moguls, whatever you want to call it, ever. But Lachlan certainly is much more comfortable with right-wing politics than Rupert is. I mean, Rupert is he's got much more of a skeptical journalist's mind, but they've seen an opportunity, and they've essentially legitimized a lot of crazy stuff. And so what used to be a news organization that I would say more often lent to the right than the left, that's true, very true, but nonetheless, by and large, reported the news as it happened, and had commentary, and had commentary that was not always of the right. That has moved to becoming literally a force of propaganda. And the problem is that this propaganda has done enormous damage. I mean, ask yourself this question. What does Vladimir Putin, clearly an adversary of the United States, does not have your best interests at heart, to say the least? What is the objective of Putin's disinformation campaigns? It is basically to divide Americans, turn Americans against each other, and undermine your faith in and trust in your political institutions. Well, I attended January the 6th. That wasn't inspired by the Russians. That was absolutely homegrown, and you guys live there, as I say. From my perspective, Fox News had by far the largest single media input into that madness. I mean, it was, and when after January the 6th, Fox dialed back, they obviously realized, they thought, they probably thought, good heavens, we're going to get arraigned on some kind of conspiracy charge. This is getting very ugly. The Fox viewers started leaving en masse. This is the problem. So essentially, having, created this monster, this media monster, and then set it running, they can't escape it. I mean, it is a really shocking state of affairs. I mean, the biggest threat to American democracy is within, but we're going a little bit away from climate. Let me draw us back to COVID and climate. So what do we know about the COVID pandemic? We know that the countries and the communities that followed the science and whose communities trusted their governments had the best experience of it to date. Those countries where the science was questioned, where there was low levels of trust in government, did it. The United States and the UK are good examples of that. Now, both countries are cracking on with vaccinations at a terrific pace, and well done. Wish we were able to do the same, or had done the same. But nonetheless, I mean, if we are prepared to follow the science on COVID, why are we not prepared to follow it on climate?
Right.
I mean, where did one of the things that struck me as most poignant about the American presidential campaign was Joe Biden repeatedly having to say, wearing a mask is not a political statement. I mean, what does it tell you that he actually had to say that? I mean, in East Asia, if you're in Tokyo or Shanghai or Beijing, Hong Kong or whatever, if you wake up in the morning and you've got a sniffle or sneeze, you wouldn't think of getting on the bus or the subway without wearing a mask. It's just being courteous and sensible. So what was just blindingly obviously sensible conduct was pilloried and characterized as leftist authoritarian. You've got a crazy congresswoman who's compared wearing masks to, wearing the yellow Star of David and, in Nazi Germany for, one of the, indignities heaped on the Jewish community there. I mean, like, this is crackers.
Yeah.
And yet it's been legitimized by this right-wing media ecosystem.
So if it's not slowing down, what do we actually do about it?
Okay, well, that's like not just a really good question, that is the question. And I wish I had a good answer to it. But I think there's a couple of things you've got to do. I think the non-crazy media has got to call it out. The non-crazy media has got to be careful that they do not become as biased in the other direction too. You know, it is very important when you're seeing, Fox going off into madder and madder areas of opinion and, getting less and less tethered to the facts. It's important that the other mainstream media outlets don't do the same thing in the other direction. So that's so that is, and that requires a degree of discipline. I think that's important. I think another thing that is worth thinking about, and I recognize this is a long bow for America, but I'll just make a couple of suggestions. One of American, firstly, you have to be relentless in opposing all of this voter suppression. I mean, to me, as an Australian, former politician, I am just gobsmacked, astounded at the way in which it is regarded as legitimate, apparently, to manipulate your electoral system so as to suppress voting from poor people, black people, brown people, whatever, whoever it is you don't like. I mean, just in our country, whatever your politics, it's always been fundamental that the electoral system should be managed so as to encourage every single adult, to be on the electoral roll and to vote. So we have a couple of things here that are very different to you. We have a federal electoral commission, and the states have similar ones, which are independent, and they set constituency, what you'd call district boundaries in an objective way. So gerrymandering is not a thing here. The other thing is we have compulsory voting. Now, that doesn't mean, technically, it's compulsory attendance. So what it means is you've got to actually turn up and take a ballot paper. You can write all politicians suck on it, or, down with Malcolm or whatever you want to do. But you've got to take that ballot paper and stick it in the box, and it can be an informal vote if you like. Now, this is really important because so these two things, I'll just talk about the importance of them. Firstly, compulsory voting means that in an election campaign, you don't have to go crazy to get your base out. In America, the Republicans will head off to the right, the Democrats to the left, to get their rusted on voters off the porch and get them to vote. Here, that's not a problem because, voting participation is well over 90%, because there are always people, by the way, who either forget to vote or are traveling or sick or, whatever. There's lots of excuses for not doing it. So that's good. So that means the political debate is more at the center. And this, of course, is related to the districting. So if you have a district that is gerrymandered so only a Republican can win it, then the general election is not that important. What really matters is the primary. And so again, because, registered Republicans are more off to the right than the general public, that means the candidates have to run off to the right. And again, that's not as big a feature here. So I think those, that type of thing is helpful. I mean, ideally, I guess in compulsory voting is probably too, long a bridge to contemplate in America, but independent, objective, non-gerrymandered districting, I know, has a lot of supporters, and some states are trying to achieve that. That is an absolute must. And if you do that, then you have more seats that are contestable. So the more districts you have that are genuinely contestable, the more the general election matters rather than the primary. And it means that Republicans are going to have to say to themselves in a contestable district, look, I may prefer crazy guy over here's political opinions to sensible guy or gal here's political opinions, but we better select the sensible person because they're the only one that's got a chance of winning the seat.
Well, switching gears a little bit, there's been a lot of criticism of the impacts, of the negative impacts of free market forces on the environment. And I know you are a believer in the value of markets, but why do you think markets haven't led to greater reduction in carbon emissions, which you would expect should be the rational response to a warming planet?
Well, yeah, I mean, the problem is that we're not pricing the externality of pollution, you know. So if you want to, if you know, this is why a carbon price makes sense. If you have and I look, as I used to, I mean, I was the environment minister when we first proposed an emissions trading scheme in Australia, and I introduced the first legislation to implement it. This is when an emissions trading scheme was the policy of the Liberal Party, which in Australia, as you probably know, is our centre-right party. I know sounds odd to Americans, but it's, you know, equivalent of the UK Conservatives, although I wouldn't say anymore it's the equivalent of the American Republicans. But anyway, yeah. So if you have a carbon price, then obviously that the market will respond. The market is responding to the realities, however, of cheaper generation. So you know, leaving aside the carbon question, if the three of us were the board of an energy company and, you know, we had to provision another 1,000 megawatts of generation, you know, for our customers, whatever, you know, let's say it had to be 100,000 megawatts of dispatchable generation. Certainly in Australia, you wouldn't give a moment's thought to doing it with coal. You would say, right, we will assemble a portfolio of renewables and we will back that up with pumped hydro / batteries. You might have some gas, you might have a gas peaker there. But you can see coming down the track, green hydrogen will be the peaking fuel of choice. And that, of course, is one of the agendas I'm working on with Andrew Forrest's Fortescue Future Industries green hydrogen agenda. So that's that's the next big thing. I mean, if there's anything that will compete with pumped hydro for long duration storage, it's green hydrogen, in my judgment.
Well, in your book, you detailed this incredible exchange that you had with President Obama about Saudi Arabia's negative influence on Indonesia, as well as other countries in the region. And you pressed him on this, on why America continues to support the Saudi regime despite all of this. And President Obama responded to you and said, one word, oil. So what were you thinking during that exchange?
Well, I mean, it made sense to me. I think it's that was undoubtedly true. I mean, Obama has talked about, he actually related that exchange, I think, to a writer for The Atlantic. So it's very, each of us remembered it very vividly.
I was going to say, yeah.
Because, I mean, Indonesia's a country that I don't know nearly as well as Obama, of course, because he spent part of his childhood there, but it's incredibly important to Australia. And a big part of my foreign policy agenda was to, increase the level and intensity of engagement with Indonesia. And we had a lot of success there. The Saudi Wahhabist agenda in Indonesia has taken a country whose, Indonesian Islam, and I mean, you're talking about an incredibly big, diverse, spread out country. So this is wild generalization to be taken with several grains of salt. But Indonesian Islam overall has become much more fundamentalist, at least in many parts of the country, and that's, and that is because Indonesia, as my good friend the president Joko Widodo says, Indonesia is proof that Islam is compatible with democracy and moderation, and that is that is put under test by some of the Islamist parties in Indonesia now.
Well, you go on in the book to say that we are now living with the consequences of the deals made between America and Saudi Arabia. So what consequences were you referring to there?
Well, we're living with the fact that, Islamist, Islamist terrorism, I mean, is a big part of that. But the political construct in Saudi Arabia was essentially that the Wahhabist clergy got to run that part, the religious side of the polity, and the House of Sword got to run, actually rule. But that has taken that branch of Islam and the people that it's funded into much more, into a much more intolerant, less moderate environment. One of the great paradoxes of all of this, perhaps it's more an irony than a paradox, is that if you go back a couple of hundred years, and certainly if you go back 500 or 600 years, by and large, Islamic societies were more tolerant and respectful of other religions than Christian ones were. The Jewish experience, for example, in the Islamic world was, it wasn't, I'm not saying it was free from oppression, but it was much less oppressed than it was in the Christian West. And you've only got to look at the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, or, following Ferdinand and Isabella's conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, or, of course, all the pogroms in Eastern Europe, not to speak of the Holocaust in the 20th century. But that has changed. And I mean, one of the consequences of the wars in the Middle East that, America's and Australia have been engaged in as America's ally, is that you've taken societies, Iraq is a good example, where there was a very, a substantial non-Muslim minority, not Jews anymore, because that following the establishment of the State of Israel, the Jewish diaspora in places like Iraq, were largely expelled or left or, driven out. But the big Christian minority in Iraq, particularly on the Nineveh Plains, was, one of the most ancient Christian communities in the world. I mean, they have been so oppressed by, the extremism that is seen, and you're essentially finding minorities being caught between the Shia hammer and the Sunni anvil. This is why, for example, in Syria, why the Christians in Syria supported Bashar al-Assad. I don't think too many people had any delusions about him being a benign leader or anything other than the murderous tyrant he was. But he, perhaps because his family came from the Alawite minority, were not, seeking to impose an exclusive, mono-religious state, I guess. And look, the truth is that in so many parts of the world, and the Middle East is a good example, you have environments where historically, for hundreds of years, people of different religions and ethnicities lived more or less, harmoniously together. And I stress the more or less, but today are not able to live together at all. So, for all of our technology and advance, there are many parts of the world which are materially less tolerant than they were, less respectful of difference than they were a century or two ago.
Well, we saw in the 70s, Saudi Arabia really flex their influence on the world's energy supply, which then played into the global oil crises that rocked that decade. And it makes us wonder, what would have happened if countries like America or like Australia had done more to not only ensure their own energy security through domestic sources like coal and gas, but really invested more heavily in clean, renewable energy. So these technologies would have been adopted decades ago. I mean, what are some of the ways you think geopolitics over the last 50 years would have been different had that been the case?
Well, there's no question that if the countries that in the 70s had been very dependent on Saudi and Gulf oil, had their own sufficient alternative energy sources, of course, geopolitics would have been very different. I mean, absolutely, it's I think one of the look, there's just no doubt about that. It's been energy independence is of vital importance. And by the way, most countries are able, one way or another, to generate plenty of their own electricity, particularly with renewables. Now, this is again a big generalization, but you take a country, take Australia as an example. We import most of the oil we use. We do produce some oil in Australia, not a huge amount. We don't have many refineries anymore, so we are dependent on imported oil. If we electrify our vehicle fleet, as we will do one way or another, and the government's not really promoting this, but it should be, but it's going to happen anyway. That makes you much more energy independent. Like if you are a political conservative anxious about energy security, you should be absolutely supporting electric vehicles, and in whatever form, whether they're Teslas or hydrogen fuel cell vehicles.
Well, what country do you believe will emerge as the global leader in clean energy production, and how do you think that will reshape geopolitics?
Well, look, I mean, despite our appalling political impasse on these issues, Australia will be a big player in the clean energy future. And that is because we've got a lot of sunshine and, above all, a lot of low value real estate. If you are, if you're a densely populated country, or you, in a latitude where your solar resource is not so great, it's more of a challenge. But Australia, we've got, there are plans in Australia now for new solar farms literally running into thousands and thousands of hectares. And that land, if you were to sell it, is worth, it's, worth a few dollars a hectare. It's like because it is so arid, there's not really much you can do with it. So bottom line is, yes, I think we will be able to produce an abundance of energy. Now, the problem is then what do you do with it? There is a project here called Sun Cable, which is, again, it'd be worth interviewing the founders of that project to generate a huge amount of solar energy and wind energy in Northern Australia and take it by subsea high voltage DC cable to Singapore. And that's, I mean, where people are skeptical about that, they're skeptical about the cable part of it. But the generation side of it is absolutely very clear. There's a company I'm actually a shareholder in called 5B, B for Bob, which has developed a really, AES actually, the American energy company is a shareholder in it as well. They've developed a technique for rolling out solar panels, which are prefabricated, sort of like a concertina structure. So you've got your flat field and the semi-trailers turn up, the container comes off, the door comes down, and you just literally unfold this solar array. And, and those type of techniques are dramatically reducing the cost of deployment. So yes, we can do that. So how else do you generate, export that energy? Well, one is hydrogen. Now, green hydrogen, which of course is made by electrolyzing water, needs a lot of electricity, needs cheap electricity. Hydrogen's actually quite hard to transport. So you can make ammonia, which is nitrogen and hydrogen, and that is yet better able to be transported. And there's a big market for green ammonia and green hydrogen, particularly in North Asia. Ammonia can be used effectively as a fuel. I mean, you could switch over time the fuel that's used to power shipping from bunker, which is about as filthy a fuel as you can imagine, to ammonia. The other thing, of course, is you use cheap electricity to make stuff. That's whether that is green aluminium or green steel. As you know, hydrogen can be used effectively as the flux, in the way that carbon or coke, is used to take in a blast furnace, to take the oxygen out of ferrous oxide or iron ore. And of course, the oxygen bonds with the carbon and goes out the stack as CO2, which is bad. If you have that similar process with hydrogen, the oxygen bonds with the hydrogen and goes out the stack as steam, as water. So yeah, I think Australia's got a huge opportunity, but so do other countries, with the combination of lots of real estate, low value real estate, and lots of sunshine. Parts of the United States fit that bill too. America is the lucky country in every respect. Obviously, the Saudis are very focused on this as well. I mean, the Saudis and the Gulfies are very conscious of the fact that they're a post, fossil fuel world is approaching, and so they absolutely want to be part of the clean energy agenda as well.
It's just really a shame you couldn't get in the weeds with us on clean energy technology. How do you think the United States is seen on the global stage? You talked about, kind of the accolades. Obviously President Biden is taking this seriously, but the United States pulled out of the Paris Agreement, and obviously with the Kyoto Protocol, the United States opposed that as well. So with these, with bailing on international treaties on climate, do you see the United States reputation diminish at all?
Yeah, look, I think America's reputation took a big hit under Trump. No question about that. I mean, that is a penetrating glimpse of the obvious to say that. But I think Biden is restoring it. Biden is essentially a resumption of normal transmission. And so people are relieved to see a conventional administration back. They're not looking for, revolutionary leadership or anything radical. But, Trump was perceived as an aberration. Now, of course, he might be back. And, the fact that the Republican Party seems to have signed up to his continued hegemony is very troubling. I mean, that is, this is gets back to the media problem. So if you've got people that are living, in a media echo chamber or bubble, of Fox News, right-wing social media channels, and they believe stuff that is simply untrue and in some cases mad. I mean, QAnon, you've got Congress people that take QAnon seriously, right? I mean, that is, we've had an issue here in Australia where one of the prime ministers our current Prime Minister's good friends, is a prominent QAnon, supporter, promoter, whatever, devotee. I'm not quite sure how they describe themselves. But that is this market for crazy is a major problem, and I think we cannot get into this sort of alternative fact nonsense. This is the problem. If you say, the Earth is round, okay, the Earth is round, and someone else comes along and says the Earth is flat, and says, because I'm saying the Earth is flat, I've got an alternative view and I need to have equal time. And my view is just as legitimate as yours. So you get, this is the problem that you face, where you've got people who are literally telling lies are normalized and legitimized. I mean, Jim Clapper, who I was talking to about this the other day, described it as a truth deficit, which is it's a kind of a think tanky way, I suppose, an academic way of just saying lies. But it is, we can't lose sight of objective reality. And I mean, again, you see this with you see this on climate all the time. So, I mean, I think a lot of, well, I'll give you an example. So years ago, as a guy who I refer to in my book, but you wouldn't know who he is, but there's a prominent business leader in Australia was peddling all this climate denialist stuff to me. And I said, where do you get all this stuff? This is rubbish, what you're saying. And he said, oh, I get it off the web. And so he'd sent me some of these web pages, which were actually from the Lyndon LaRouche organization, so truly mad stuff. Anyway, I got one of our top climate scientists at the ANU to do a little one-pager for him with lots of references and so forth. And I sent it to him. He came back and he said, oh, the Australian National University, they're just in the same global conspiracy as the United Nations and, all the climate scientists. So you're dealing with that kind of madness. So I turned to him and I said, okay, so let me tell you, let's say you were diagnosed with a serious disease, cancer, heart disease, whatever. I said, would you base your therapy on what you'd picked up on a website? Or would you go and find the best, specialist you could and follow his or her advice? And that is, and well, the answer is obvious. But so this is where I hope, I'm not that optimistic, but I hope that COVID carries with it a lesson that, we realize that if you follow the science and you are, you take that seriously and diligently, you'll get a much better outcome than if you believe in, drinking bleach or, whatever sort of magical stuff that was being peddled by the populist right in your country and indeed in mine to a lesser extent.
Well, President Trump's science denial in part is one of the reasons he got COVID. And, he got COVID. And I'm curious, you obviously detail your conversations with President Trump, especially on trade and asylum seekers in a bigger picture. But I'm curious, did you talk to President Trump about climate change?
No, I didn't. No, I think he would have known enough about me and I knew enough about him to it just wasn't, it was not going to be productive, I did encourage him to stay in Paris, and I encouraged him to stay in the TPP. And there were plenty of people in his administration who took the same view. Gary Cohen did. Jared Kushner, certainly said he did. But I think on that, on both, Trump was not only, ideologically and personally opposed to both those international agreements, but he had made a commitment to pull out of it. And one thing he was, he's a very clever politician, but one thing he realized was that if you make an election commitment, you've really got to do everything you can to stick to it. Because, that is one of the gripes that people have against politicians. They don't, deliver. Now, of course, Donald in his election campaign in 2016 did not think he was going to win. And so he said, there's a lot of things he said, promised that he thought, well, it doesn't matter what I say, I'm not going to win. I mean, no one ever accused me of breaking an election promise. And one of the reasons for that is because I made very few. I'd like to think if I'd made more, I would have kept them too. But I didn't, I was always very, very careful about what I actually pledged I would do. So, when Trump said he would build a wall, I don't know, that resonated and sounded good to his supporters. But then, of course, having said that, he had to do it.
Yeah.
And, the rest is history.
I'm curious what you've made. President Biden's obviously facing obstacles to his the promises that he made because of the structure of our government, especially our Senate with the filibuster. Reading a bigger picture, your government was able to get a lot of things done. I know more about Australian tax policy than I ever thought I would know. Just reading the book, well, your government was able to pass things. What do you make of President Biden potentially not being able to enact things that match the desires or the will of the people in the United States, especially on climate?
Well, the filibuster is a scandal. I mean, you guys have forgotten more about that than I'll ever know, but it is ludicrous to say that you need a 60% majority to get anything passed. It's crazy. One of the difficulties, of course, is the representativeness of your Senate. And, it obviously has us because, the smaller states have the same number of senators as the bigger states. And that's same with us, by the way, but we have fewer states, obviously. But that creates that, that is crazy, right? And it tends to just slow down government, and particularly when you don't have bipartisanship. Let me share with you an interesting sort of insight into Obama and this problem. Robert Putnam, you'd be familiar with, the author of Bowling Alone, the Harvard social scientist. Years ago, when Obama was still president, Putnam was in Sydney, came and had lunch with us. And Obama was one of his students. And he said that Obama had as a young guy, he had an amazing ability to conciliate people and bring them together. He said he was kind of ideal for that community organizer sort of role he had. So he could sit down at a table with 10 people, everyone with different views, many of them violently opposed to each other, and Barack would be able to draw a consensus out of it, right? And, Putnam said, he said, theoretically, that's an incredible skill for a president to have. But the problem is that Washington is so polarized now that there aren't enough people that are prepared to cross the aisle because their constituents, their party members back in their districts and states are crazier than ever. And so there just isn't, particularly on the Republican side, a willingness to conciliate. So you've got to be able to take a much tougher line. And I think, Biden is obviously trying to do that. Now, in Australia, we have a parliamentary system. So why is X Prime Minister? They're Prime Minister because they have a majority of votes in the House of Representatives, the lower house, which is like your house based on population. Our Senate, which is similar to yours, each state has the same number of senators. And although the 2 federal territories have 2 senators each, it's elected on proportional representation. So, that basically means you've generally got a crossbench of smaller parties, i.e. not the Labor Party or the Liberal Party or National Party. And so you've generally got to win over people on the crossbench to get stuff through. Now, we were able to do that more often than not. Sometimes we were disappointed, but you never, it's very, very rare for one side of politics to control the Senate in Australia. I mean, it's happened, I can only think of one time in the last 40 years or so. And so essentially that you either, to get stuff through the Senate, you either have to do a deal with the opposition, which is fine, or you have to cobble together the extra votes on the crossbench. And so that's, I spent a lot of time doing that. So a lot of the, like reading Obama's memoir and all of the politicking in the Senate and so forth that he had to do, it was familiar, but honestly, it's easier in Australia. You're dealing with, because you're not dealing with people who are absolutely adamantly out to kill you. You're dealing with people who are, in the on the crossbench, and there's always a bit of horse trading and so forth that you can do to get the numbers.
Obviously, as you detail in the book, whether it's clean energy policy or emissions reductions, you had a lot of battles over those policies during your time in government. But obviously, now I'm just curious, just to wrap up here. Clearly, you're investing and you're interested in clean energy technologies. What makes you optimistic when you look at this climate crisis fight and how we're going to approach it?
Well, look, what makes me optimistic is that we have the means to solve the problem, right? We don't. Yes, the technology will improve. Yes, but we can do it now. I mean, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. The wheel has been reinvented, if you like, already in the energy space, and we can optimize it. I mean, I'm sure the PV modules of 10 years hence will be, I know they'll be more efficient than the ones of today, but we can do it. So we've got the means to have abundant, lower cost, zero emission energy. The only thing that is lacking is the will, and in some places the finance, and that's particularly in the developing world. So we've got to make sure we provide that. But the reality is, as I said, if you want to generate whether it's 1,000 megawatts or 100 megawatts or 1 megawatt of power, the cheapest way to do that from the outset, de novo, is with renewables plus storage. So, we can wean ourselves away from fossil fuels, and we just have to, we need the political will and determination to do it. And there are good signs coming out of Washington and, most recently the G7. So that's good. And it's whether it is green hydrogen or pumped storage or, solar technology, I'm certainly very involved in it, and it's a part of my business and my passion.
Well, again, your memoir, A Bigger Picture, is definitely worth a read for the listeners of this podcast. Malcolm Turnbull, thank you again for joining the Climate Pod.
Thank you so much. Great to talk to you both. Good luck.